He was a millionaire CEO with a ticking clock. She was a maid with a son she couldn't afford to lose. 7 months. That's all Ethan Calloway had to remarry or lose everything his late father built, but falling in love again. That wasn't part of the plan. Not after burying the only woman he ever loved. Grace Whitman didn't believe in second chances. Not when her nights were spent scrubbing floors and her days were filled with hospital bills she could never pay. She needed a miracle. What she got was a contract marriage with a man who barely remembered her name. But what happens when a cold business deal turns into something warmer than either expected? What secrets was Ethan hiding before he ever met her? And when the contract ends, will she walk away? Or finally choose to stay? This is not just a love story. It's about healing, redemption, and the kind of family you never see coming. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reach deep into the soul. Now, let's begin. Ethan Calloway had everything except time, and what he was about to lose wasn't just his fortune. The sea outside the windows of his Camden estate was quiet that morning, a stillness that didn't match the storm gathering inside him. The sky was the color of steel, a fog creeping in from the bay, softening the sharp edges of the rocky shore. He stood barefoot on the cold wood floors of the sunroom, holding a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. The house echoed with silence, just as it had for years. At 44, Ethan was the last of the old Calloway line, CEO of the family's century-old maritime logistics company. The business was vast shipping lanes, coastal freight, deep-water vessels his life built on tides and timetables, and he ran it with a mind that didn't miss much. But today, numbers and spreadsheets couldn't help him. Not with this. The call had come 3 days earlier. Ms. Taylor would like to go over your father's final arrangements. In person. Ethan had nodded quietly, half expecting this. His father had been dying for months, tucked away in the old stone house in Portland, too proud to accept help, too bitter to say goodbye. Their last words had been sharp. Still, he'd gone to the funeral, stood alone, no eulogy, no emotion, just a graveside rainstorm and a half-dozen gray suits pretending to care. Now, Ms. Taylor sat across from him in the study, her leather briefcase open between them, the old grandfather clock ticking far too loudly. She was in her 60s, a family fixture for as long as he could remember, with clipped tones and the kind of gaze that made boardroom executives nervous. Your father updated his will 6 months before he passed, she said without looking up, as there are conditions for the transfer of majority ownership. Ethan blinked, setting his mug down harder than he meant to. Conditions. She finally met his eyes. Yes, specifically, that you must be legally married before your 45th birthday. Otherwise, control of Calloway Maritime will be permanently transferred to your brother. The word brother left a bitter taste in Ethan's mouth. Travis, he asked, though he already knew. Ms. Taylor didn't flinch. Yes, the clause is ironclad. There are no loopholes. The silence that followed was thick. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the oak-paneled ceiling, trying to steady the thudding in his chest. It wasn't the money, he had enough of that. It was the legacy. The company his grandfather built from nothing but a fishing boat and a dream. The company Ethan had poured his entire adult life into, rebuilding it after the 2008 crash, expanding into international waters, modernizing the fleet. And now it could all vanish because of a technicality and a father who never believed he was enough without a ring on his finger. I'm not interested in pretending, Ethan said after a while, his voice low. I don't believe your father cared whether it was love or not. Ms. Taylor replied, only that it was legal, public, and permanent for at least 6 months. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on his ribs. Travis would love this. Always the opportunist, the polished younger son who smiled at cameras and schemed behind closed doors. He'd tried to get on the board more than once. Now he wouldn't have to. If Ethan didn't marry in time, it was over. After Ms. Taylor left, Ethan stayed seated in the study for hours, long after the sun had disappeared behind the gray Atlantic sky. He read the clause a dozen times, ran through every possible way out. None existed. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. It was a personal ambush delivered from beyond the grave. By nightfall, the house was quiet again, save for the occasional creak of the old floors and the distant cry of seagulls. Ethan wandered the halls like a ghost, past rooms he hadn't touched in years. His late wife's old reading nook was still by the window, dust gathering on her worn copy of Moby Dick. A chill settled in his chest. He hadn't let anyone get close since she died, hadn't dated, hadn't tried. What was the point? His world was work, structure, predictability. Emotions were messy, vulnerability, dangerous. Now he had a deadline. Back in the kitchen, he opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. The housekeeper, an older woman named Ruth, had gone home for the weekend. But someone else was working tonight, a newer hire, younger, quiet. He barely remembered her name. That's when he heard it. A voice, low and muffled, coming from the butler's pantry just off the kitchen. Not speaking, exactly, pleading. "I'm doing everything I can. Please. He's just a boy." The words were thick with tears, the kind of raw grief that pierced right through walls. Ethan froze. He wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but something in that voice, a tremble, a desperation held him in place. He stepped closer, soundlessly, and peered around the doorway. A woman sat on the small bench beneath the pantry window, back hunched over a cell phone, her hand pressed to her temple. She looked no older than mid-30s, her hair pulled back in a rushed bun, apron still on. She was speaking into the phone so softly, it was clear she didn't want to be heard. "I don't have that kind of money," she whispered. I'm trying so hard." He didn't know her name, but in that moment, Ethan Calloway, for the first time in years, felt something break open in his chest. Not pity, not curiosity, something that looked a little like concern, and he didn't know it yet. But that one moment hearing her cry in the shadows of his quiet home was about to change everything. Grace never imagined her life would shrink to scrubbing the floor of a man who didn't even know her name. Once, she had stood at the front of a second-grade classroom, voice soft but steady, reading Charlotte's Web to a room full of sleepy-eyed kids. Once, she had believed in quiet routines, packing her husband's lunch in the morning, kissing her son's forehead before school, grading spelling tests by lamplight. But that was 3 years ago. Now, at 35, Grace Whitman spent her mornings polishing granite countertops and folding stiff linen napkins in a house where no one spoke to her unless something needed fixing. She arrived before 7, before the coastal mist lifted from the Calloway property. The estate was silent, most days too large, too old, too hollow. It smelled of salt, money, and closed windows. The kind of house where your footsteps felt too loud, even when walking on plush rugs. Grace moved like a shadow. She took quiet pride in her work, never left a streak on the windows, never allowed dust to collect beneath the bookshelves. She learned how Mr. Calloway liked his refrigerator arranged water bottles to the left, condiments grouped by use, labels turned forward. Not that he ever noticed. He barely looked at her. On the rare mornings when he passed her in the hallway, he would offer a stiff nod, eyes focused on something far away. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it. The less attention, the better. Especially from men like him, powerful, polished, unreachable. After her husband died in a construction accident, Grace had unraveled slowly, not in public, not the kind of unraveling people whispered about, just quietly. Bills piled up. The school district offered unpaid leave. Grief was heavy, but single motherhood was heavier. She sold her wedding ring to pay for Lucas's first round of blood transfusions. When the money ran out, she cleaned houses Camden's wealthy had more rooms than they knew what to do with. It was Ruth, the longtime housekeeper, who'd given her a shot at the Calloway estate. "He won't talk to you," Ruth had warned, handing her a spare apron. "Just do your job, and he'll pretend you don't exist." That suited Grace just fine. She needed the paycheck, not the conversation. Lucas was 9 now, bright-eyed, rail-thin, obsessed with outer space. He asked questions faster than she could answer them. His condition, diamond black fan anemia, was rare and unrelenting. Monthly treatments, iron infusions, frequent hospital trips to Boston. Insurance covered part of it, but the rest sat like a mountain on her chest. And now, that mountain had grown. The call came just after 8 p. When she'd finished disinfecting the guest bathroom on the 3rd floor, she stepped into the butler's pantry to take it, pulling the door closed behind her. "Mrs. Whitman," the voice said gently. "Yes, this is she. This is Marcia from the pediatric hematology department. I'm afraid we need to schedule Lucas's next round of treatment sooner than expected. His latest labs came back. Concerning." Grace's knees buckled slightly. She sank onto the bench beneath the small window. "How soon?" she whispered. "Next week. We're worried about his red count dropping too low. I haven't paid off the last round yet." There was a pause. Then the gentle, bureaucratic voice returned. "We can't move forward without a financial plan in place." "I'm sorry." Grace pinched the bridge of her nose. She wanted to scream, to curse, but instead, she just folded in on herself. "I'm working extra shifts," she said. "I've sold everything I can sell. I just need more time. I understand, Mrs. Whitman, but we need a firm commitment. Perhaps you could apply for emergency credit. No bank will give me that kind of money. I'm a housekeeper. I clean for a living." Her voice cracked on the last word. The line went quiet, and Grace, defeated, lowered the phone. She sat there for a long moment, trembling. Her palms were raw from scrubbing. Her back ached, and still. It wasn't enough. "I'm trying," she whispered into the quiet. "God, I'm trying so hard." She didn't know that someone was listening, just outside the pantry door, beyond the archway of the kitchen. Ethan Calloway stood frozen. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He had come down for a bottle of water, assuming the house was empty. But the sound of her voice cracking, breaking, pleading rooted him to the floor. It wasn't just the words, but the tone. It was grief, the kind that didn't make noise unless it had nowhere else to go. And something inside him shifted. Grace, oblivious, wiped her cheeks quickly. She couldn't afford to cry. Not here. Not now. She had rooms left to check, floors to mop, silverware to polish. She shoved her phone into the deep pocket of her apron and stood. She returned to her duties with the same quiet precision as always, but her shoulders sagged a little more. Her movements were slower, as if every step cost her something. Ethan didn't say a word. He watched her slip silently out of the pantry, watched her reach for a towel and begin polishing the sink faucet with mechanical care. She didn't know he was there, didn't know he'd heard every word. He turned and left before she noticed. That night. Grace walked the long road home in the chill of early spring. Her mother was watching Lucas, warming up soup for dinner. Grace kissed her boy goodnight, tucked his favorite stuffed giraffe into the crook of his arm, and sat beside his bed long after he'd fallen asleep. She didn't know how she was going to find the money. She only knew she had to. Morning came gray and windy. Grace arrived at the Calloway house at her usual time, slipping in through the side entrance and hanging her coat on the designated hook. She adjusted her apron, tied her hair back, and started gathering supplies. But before she could reach the cleaning closet, she heard something unexpected. Her name, Grace. A low voice said. She turned. Mr. Calloway stood in the hall outside the study, dressed in a navy sweater and slacks, holding a folder in one hand. He never used her name. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. "In the library." She blinked. The library. No one went in there, not even Ruth. It was his sanctuary off limits and untouched. Heart thudding. Grace set down the duster and followed him down the hall. She had no idea that everything she thought she knew about this job, about this man, was about to change. She expected to be fired. Instead, he offered her something far more dangerous: hope. The morning sun filtered dimly through the high windows of the Callaway Library, painting stripes of gold across the floor. The room was cavernous, the air tinged with the scent of aged wood and worn leather. Shelves climbed all the way to the ceiling, lined with books whose spines whispered of old money and older secrets. Grace stood just inside the doorway, uncertain. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her apron, knuckles white. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been this nervous. Maybe at her husband's funeral. Maybe the day she held Lucas for the first time and didn't know how to be both mother and father. Maybe never quite like this. Ethan Callaway sat behind a large desk, his posture straight, but his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to sit. She didn't move. "If this is about last night," she began, her voice careful. "I'm sorry. I never meant for my personal life to interfere with my work." "It didn't," he said flatly. The silence after that was deafening. Grace shifted uncomfortably. "I know I'm just the housekeeper," she added, "but I'm doing the best I can. Please, I need this job. I can be more careful." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes on the flames that weren't lit. "I heard everything," he said quietly. Grace flinched, shame rising to her cheeks. "I didn't mean I know." He turned to face her. "That's not why I asked you here." She blinked, confused. "I have a proposal," he said. "Not for work, for something else." Grace's body tensed. She took a half step back, unsure what he meant and not sure she wanted to know. Ethan noticed and held up his hands. "Not that kind of proposal. I need you to listen." He walked back to the desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out a thin stack of papers. "My father died recently," he began, and with his death came a clause in his will. "It states that I must be legally married by my 45th birthday, or I lose majority ownership of Callaway Maritime." Grace didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat. "That's 7 months from now," he continued. "If I don't comply, my half-brother inherits everything. And you're telling me this because I want you to marry me." The words hit her like a slap. She let out a nervous laugh, short, bitter, disbelieving. "Is this a joke? I'm serious," he said calmly. "A legal marriage. 7 months, no strings, no expectations beyond public appearances. In return, I'll pay for your son's treatment, all of it, up front." Grace stared at him, heart pounding. "You don't even know me. I know enough." She shook her head. "This is crazy." "It's practical," he replied. "You need money. I need a wife. It's a transaction. Nothing more." Grace's stomach turned. "And when the 7 months are up, we file for divorce. You keep the money. I keep my company. We go our separate ways." She took a step back, feeling the walls closing in. "And if I say no," he looked at her evenly, "then nothing changes. You go back to cleaning floors. Your son waits for treatment. I lose my company. We both lose." Her throat tightened. "What makes you think I'd agree to something like this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Because you love your son more than anything." The words landed hard, too hard. She turned away, blinking fast, trying to gather her thoughts. "You think you can buy people?" she asked quietly. "No," Ethan said. "I'm offering help. I'm giving you a choice." Grace stood in silence, her eyes fixed on the window overlooking the sea. The waves were calm today, but inside her, everything churned. Part of her wanted to scream, to accuse him of being manipulative, heartless, transactional. But another part, the part that watched Lucas sleep with his lips pale and his breath shallow, knew she didn't have many choices left. Ethan slid the papers across the desk. "I've already contacted the hospital," he said. "Lucas's next round of treatment is scheduled. The bill has been paid." Grace's heart stopped. "What? Whether you agree or not, I paid it. He shouldn't suffer because of me. She walked slowly to the desk, hands trembling. The top sheet of the document bore the hospital's letterhead. Her name, Lucas's patient ID, paid in full. She didn't speak. Couldn't. Ethan's voice softened. You can say no. Walk out that door. Keep the money. But if you stay, we sign the contract. Tomorrow. We get married. Grace felt like the air had left the room. She gathered the papers into a neat stack, clutching them to her chest like a shield. I need to think, she said. He nodded. You have until tomorrow morning. She turned and left the room without another word. That night, Grace sat on the worn couch in her mother's living room, surrounded by old photographs and unpaid bills. Lucas was asleep in the back bedroom, his breathing wheezy but steady. The house smelled of chamomile and old paint. She thought of Michael, her late husband. What would he say? Would he understand? She thought of Ethan, calm, composed, distant, and yet something in his eyes had flickered when he spoke of her son. Not pity, something else. She pulled the hospital bill from her purse and stared at the zero balance. She didn't know this man, didn't trust him. But he had done what no one else could. He had given Lucas time. The next morning, before the sun rose, Grace put on her best coat, tied her hair back, and walked the long stretch of road to the Calloway estate. She carried no bags, no hesitation, only a pen. It was the kind of wedding where no one cried because no one was really in love. The courthouse in Camden was quiet that morning, just a little building tucked between a bank and a pharmacy. Its bricks faded from years of salt air. The sky was overcast, as if the world itself couldn't decide whether to shine or rain. Grace arrived alone, holding a plain clutch and wearing a pale blue dress borrowed from her neighbor. It was a little too loose at the shoulders, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She had tied her hair back in a soft bun, the way she used to when she taught school, back when her life felt more like hers. Ethan was already there, waiting near the steps. He wore a tailored gray suit, no tie, and an expression that gave nothing away. He gave a polite nod when he saw her, then opened the door to the clerk's office without a word. There were no guests, no music, no photographer waiting to capture staged smiles. No one called Grace beautiful. No one offered Ethan a firm handshake and said, "You're a lucky man." Lucas was back at her mother's house, playing with toy astronauts and blissfully unaware that his mother was becoming someone's wife for reasons he would never understand. The ceremony itself lasted less than 8 minutes. The justice of the peace was kind but detached, as if she had learned long ago not to expect romance in courthouse unions. She read the vows in a gentle monotone, looking from one to the other with professional efficiency. Do you, Ethan James Calloway, take Grace Ann Whitman? Ethan said yes. No hesitation, no emotion, just a word spoken out of duty. Do you, Grace Ann Whitman, take Ethan James Calloway? She said yes too, but her voice caught, just slightly, enough to make her blink hard, willing the sting behind her eyes to disappear. There were no rings. That had been part of the agreement. No need for symbols when the meaning behind them wasn't real. When the justice of the peace announced them husband and wife, there was an awkward silence. You may acknowledge the union however you choose, the woman said with a faint smile, gesturing toward them. Ethan stepped forward, placed a light hand on Grace's shoulder, and kissed her cheek. It was brief, cool, and utterly devoid of affection. Then he stepped back, nodding again, as if sealing a contract rather than marking a milestone. They signed the papers. That was it. Outside, the wind had picked up. Grace wrapped her coat tightly around her borrowed dress as they walked toward the car. The ride back to the estate was wordless. Grace stared out the window, watching the ocean roll in long, lazy waves. Her hand rested in her lap, fingers twisting the fabric of her coat until the knuckles turned white. This was not the kind of marriage a little girl dreams about, but it was the kind a mother makes when there are no other options. When they reached the house, Ethan parked beside the side entrance instead of the front. He opened her door, always the gentleman, even now. Grace stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the gravel. The house looked different. Not in structure, just in meaning. It was no longer her place of work. It was now her home, at least on paper. He led her through the side hallway and up the west staircase, one she had never used before. The walls here were lined with old nautical maps, the air tinged with cedar and salt. At the end of the corridor, he stopped in front of a door she had never noticed. "This is your room," he said simply. He opened it, then stepped aside so she could enter first. The space took her breath away. It was warm, not in color. Necessarily it was all soft blues and whites, but in feeling. The light from the large bay window spilled onto the pale wood floors like morning honey. A simple bed with a quilted coverlet sat under a canopy of soft linen. There was a writing desk near the window, and in the corner, beside a tall bookshelf, sat an old rocking chair painted white, the edges worn smooth with time. Grace stepped inside slowly, her hands brushing the edge of the dresser. Then the wooden frame of the bed. Everything was understated, intentional, as if someone had considered what would bring her peace and tried to build it from scratch. When she reached the window, she gasped softly. The room overlooked the sea, not the marina or the docks, but the open water, miles and miles of it, rolling in shades of deep blue and gray. It was the kind of view people put on postcards, the kind that made you believe, if only for a moment, that the world was still full of quiet wonder. She turned toward the chair. It creaked when she touched it. "Lucas will like that," she said softly, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her but not speaking. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flickered at the mention of her son. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him. He nodded once. "If you need anything, you can ask Ruth." Then he left. The door clicked softly shut behind him. Grace walked slowly to the window again, resting her hand against the cool glass. Outside, the wind danced with the branches of the pines. The sea rolled and rolled. She wasn't sure what she was now. Not a bride, not quite a wife, but not alone either. Somewhere in between. As she stood there, staring out into the vast horizon, she let herself imagine something she hadn't dared in a long time. Not love, not yet. Just the possibility of a beginning. Two people under one roof, separated not by walls, but by everything they had lost. The days after the wedding slipped into a strange, quiet rhythm. There was no honeymoon, no celebration, just a marriage certificate tucked away in a drawer neither of them ever opened. Ethan returned to his routines like nothing had changed. He left the house before sunrise and didn't return until after dark, often locking himself in the study or making late-night calls to overseas clients. His schedule was like the tide, predictable, distant, and too vast for anyone to touch. Grace, for her part, fell back into the silence she had perfected over the past year. She moved through the halls like a shadow, soft-footed and careful not to disrupt the order of the house. Her presence was always just beyond the corner of Ethan's gaze, never too close, never too far. But something had changed. She wasn't just the help anymore, and yet she wasn't really his wife either. Each morning, she left a cup of hot tea on the table outside his study door. She didn't knock, didn't wait, but every evening the cup was returned empty, the spoon resting precisely in the center of the saucer. A silent exchange, repeated day after day. In the kitchen, Ruth watched all of this with the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen too much and said too little. She never asked questions, but her eyes followed Grace with a softness that said she understood more than she let on. Then came the weekend when Lucas visited. Grace had hesitated to bring him at first, unsure if the sprawling mansion, cold in its grandeur, could ever feel like anything close to home for a 9-year-old boy used to cramped apartments and secondhand toys. But the moment Lucas stepped into the library and saw the tall shelves full of books about whales and storms and shipwrecks, his eyes lit up like lanterns. "Mom," he whispered, "this place has pirate maps." Ethan had been in the corner, typing something on his laptop. Grace had braced for awkwardness. Instead, Ethan closed the screen and said, "Would you like me to show you one with a ghost ship?" Lucas turned to her, eyes wide with permission-seeking hope. She nodded once, unsure of what surprised her, more Lucas's eagerness or Ethan's offer. And just like that, the man who never made time for anyone sat cross-legged on the library rug with a boy whose world was small but bright. For over an hour, they flipped through pages and traced coastlines with their fingers. Ethan's voice took on a softer edge as he explained nautical legends, and Lucas hung on every word. Grace watched from the hallway, holding a tray of snacks she forgot to deliver. Her heart did something it hadn't done in a long time. It stirred, that night, as she tucked Lucas into the guest bed with blue sheets and a stuffed dolphin Ethan had left without a word. Grace found herself standing outside the study again. This time, she held a bowl of soup, but the teacup was still untouched. She knocked, hesitant, no answer. She opened the door gently and found Ethan slumped in his chair, pale and sweating, his skin flushed with fever. "Ethan," she whispered, rushing forward. He stirred but didn't open his eyes. Grace touched his forehead, then his wrist. He was burning up. She didn't think. She acted. She called Ruth for help, dampened cloths with cool water, found a blanket, then another when he started to shiver. She stayed by his side all night, wiping his forehead, murmuring soft reassurances that he never heard. It had been years since she tended to a grown man like that. The last time was Michael, her husband, in those final months when the cancer took more than it gave. She thought she had locked those memories away, but they returned now, gentle, aching, and uninvited. By morning, Ethan's fever had broken. He woke to find her asleep in the armchair, head tilted against her palm, a half-folded towel draped across her lap. He said nothing, just watched her in the hush of dawn until she stirred. Their eyes met. For once, neither looked away. From that day on, things began to shift, not dramatically, but like a boat slowly changing course at sea. Some mornings, Grace would find 2 cups of tea waiting on the table, one for him and one for her. One afternoon, she came home from a grocery run to find a book left on her pillow. Poems from the sea, old, weathered, beautiful. Another evening, as she set the table for dinner, Ethan appeared with a question about the recipe she was making. Then, without a word, he peeled carrots beside her while she chopped onions. Their conversations were small, almost delicate. The weather, the fog, the best time to plant coastal hydrangeas. But there was weight behind those words, like 2 people learning how to speak each other's language after a long silence. One gray Tuesday. Grace came downstairs to find Ethan already at the breakfast table, flipping through the newspaper. "I made coffee," he said, without looking up. She paused, surprised, then sat down opposite him. He poured her a cup. It was too strong, but she drank it anyway. They didn't speak for 10 minutes. Just the clink of spoons, the rustle of pages, and then suddenly, softly, "Grace, do you think Lucas would like sailing?" She looked up. He had used her name. Not Mrs. Calloway, not you, not silence, just her name, plain and gentle and unexpected. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Just a soft, breathless laugh that surprised even her. Then she smiled small, tired, real, and looked away quickly, blinking, so he wouldn't see the way her eyes had turned red. They didn't plan the kiss. Like the tide. It came unexpected, undeniable. The late summer evening carried with it the kind of breeze that softened even the hardest of days. The sea was calm, stretching into the horizon like a silver quilt stitched with light. Camden's lighthouse, perched like a sentinel on the rocky point, blinked its quiet rhythm across the bay. Lucas had asked to see it. He'd seen it once in a book about coastal legends, and it had become something of a dream. So they went. Ethan drove them in his old station wagon. Grace sat in the passenger seat, hair gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, her hands folded in her lap. Lucas leaned against the back window, watching the trees pass, clutching the tiny compass Ethan had given him the week before. The drive wasn't long, but it felt like a journey, the kind that left space for something unnamed to stir between them. At the lighthouse, they climbed the hill in silence, Lucas skipping ahead with the energy only 9-year-olds had. Ethan carried a thermos of cocoa and 2 folded blankets, and Grace carried her thoughts, most of which she didn't have the courage to speak aloud. They reached the top just as the sun began to dip, casting the sky in soft orange and deepening blues. The lighthouse stood tall beside them, stoic and white, its light not yet needed but present, ready. Lucas settled on a large flat rock with the blanket and cocoa. He pulled out a book and opened it like he was preparing for a show. "I'm good here," he said with a grin. "You grown-ups can go do boring grown-up things." Grace laughed softly and brushed his hair with her fingers. "He's getting more like Michael every day," she whispered, half to herself. Ethan didn't ask who Michael was. He just looked at her, something quiet in his eyes. They walked a short distance down the trail, toward the edge where the cliff met the sea. The grass was damp beneath their shoes, and the air smelled of salt and pine. Waves lapped far below, muffled and rhythmic. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "My father used to bring us here," he said. "When I was a kid, he wasn't around much, but when he was, he made a show of it. Big gestures, expensive toys, flashy vacations. But this," he gestured to the lighthouse, "this was the one place that felt real." Grace looked at him, her expression softening. "After my wife passed, I came here every week for months, just sat here, watching the light. I think I was waiting for something to make sense again." Grace's breath caught. There was no bravado in his voice, no armor, just a man, bruised by life, telling the truth in the only way he knew how. "I didn't know you came here," she said gently. Ethan smiled, almost sadly. "No one did." She hesitated, then reached out and placed her hand on his. Just enough pressure to be felt, not enough to be mistaken for anything more. Not pity, not duty, just understanding. He didn't move, didn't flinch. The warmth of her hand against his was quiet and steady like the tide at their feet. They stood that way for a long while, the lighthouse blinking behind them, the waves below whispering stories only the ocean knew. Then, without looking at her, Ethan turned just slightly, and in the kind of silence that feels like something sacred, he leaned in. The kiss was brief, soft, uncertain, but real, like something that had been waiting just beneath the surface, finally rising for air. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke. Ethan looked down. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That wasn't part of the plan." Grace tried to smile. Neither was any of this. But already, he was retreating, his hands back in his pockets, his gaze distant again. "I'll go check on Lucas." He turned and walked back up the trail without another word, and Grace stood there, alone now, staring out at the water that shimmered under the last golden light. The kiss had been so brief, so fleeting, but it had unsettled her more than she expected, not because she hadn't wanted it, but because she had, and that scared her more than anything. Later that night, the house was quieter than usual. Lucas was asleep, the lighthouse snow globe Ethan had bought him glowing softly on the nightstand. Grace sat by her window, her fingers tracing the curve of the teacup she hadn't touched. She kept replaying the moment in her head, the way he leaned in, the look in his eyes just before, the way her breath had caught. She wondered if he was thinking about it, too. She wondered if he regretted it. She wondered why a kiss so small could feel like such a shift. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, then silence. Neither of them knocked, neither of them spoke. The kiss remained unmentioned, but in the morning, when they passed each other in the hallway, there was a flicker, a pause too long, a glance too full. They didn't speak of it, but the silence between them had changed its shape. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was waiting. She was just cleaning. But what she uncovered would change everything. The morning air inside the study smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, a scent Grace had come to associate with Ethan's world. He was away on business in Portland, something about a port deal that couldn't wait. Grace, ever the housekeeper she used to be, still tidied up as part of her routine. It calmed her, gave her a sense of control over a life that still didn't feel entirely hers. The office had always been Ethan's private domain. Even now, months into their arranged marriage, she rarely entered it. But Lucas had spilled juice on a book from the study, and Grace had come in to retrieve another copy from the shelves. That's when she noticed the dust on the desk, the faint smudges on the glass. Almost on instinct, she picked up a cloth and began to clean. When she wiped around the edges of the drawer handles, one slipped open, not all the way, just enough for a thick manila folder to fall out and hit the floor with a dull thud. She knelt to pick it up. Her eyes caught the label, First Grace W. It wasn't curiosity that made her open it. It was something deeper, a kind of quiet dread, like the feeling you get when the phone rings too late at night. Inside were pages and pages of documents, printouts of her teaching history, medical records from when Lucas was first diagnosed, even old utility bills from her house in Rockport, and photos, not ones she'd ever seen, candid shots, one of her walking Lucas to school, another of her in line at the pharmacy. Her hands began to shake. This wasn't just information, it was surveillance. She sat there on the floor, the folder spread open like a wound, as disbelief gave way to something heavier, something bitter. Ethan had known who she was long before that night in the kitchen, long before the marriage proposal, long before she'd ever stepped foot inside the Calloway estate. Had he planned all of it? Was she ever anything more than a pawn in a calculated move to save his company? The kiss at the lighthouse, the teacups left for her in the morning, the way he read to Lucas, were those just pieces of a game? Her throat tightened. Her first instinct was to run, but instead, she waited. Ethan returned that evening, the salt air clinging to his coat as he entered. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy. He smiled when he saw her in the sitting room, but the smile faded quickly when he noticed the folder in her lap. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. "Your drawer," she replied, just as quietly. There was a long pause. "Grace, I can explain? Please do. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you knew everything about me before you ever offered me that contract, before you paid for Lucas's treatment, before you made me your wife." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, looking more like a man unraveling than the composed CEO she had always known. "I first saw you nearly 2 years ago," he began, "at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital in Boston. You were reading to Lucas in the corner. He had a tube in his nose, but he was smiling. Because of you. You had this light, and I couldn't forget it." Grace stared at him, stunned. "So, you had me followed. Hired someone to gather information on me. I asked a private investigator to find out who you were. At first, I just wanted to make a donation anonymously. But when your name showed up in our staffing agency's applications months later, I thought maybe it was fate." Her heart was pounding now. "You brought me into your home under false pretenses. No, I brought you in because I couldn't stop thinking about you, but I never expected to fall for you. Not like this. Not truly." Grace stood. "But you did fall for me, or for the idea of me. The woman you watched from afar." He didn't answer right away. His silence was louder than any words. "I trusted you," she said. Her voice cracked. "I let Lucas trust you." Ethan stepped forward, but she took a step back. "Don't. Just don't." She packed that night, quietly. Lucas was already asleep. She left a note for Ethan short, handwritten, no emotion between the lines. By morning, the guest room was empty, and for the first time in months, the house felt cold again. Out on the road, Grace gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Lucas dozed in the back seat, unaware. She didn't know where they were going, just away from the lie, from the man she almost let herself believe in. What she didn't know was that Ethan stood at the window until her car disappeared from view, the folder still open on the table, the last page fluttering in the breeze from the vent, a picture of Lucas holding a toy compass, smiling, and Ethan, alone again, whispered to no one, "I'm sorry." But there was no one left to hear it. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her chest. Rain lashed the side of the old farmhouse, turning the once quiet countryside into a symphony of thunder and rushing wind. Grace stood in the kitchen, staring out the small window above the sink, the glass fogging with her breath. Her mother's home, where she'd spent so much of her childhood, now felt cramped with too many thoughts, too many regrets. Lucas sat at the table behind her, quietly coloring a picture of a sailboat. He hadn't asked many questions. He didn't know the reason for their sudden departure from the estate, only that they were back with Nana for a little while. But Grace couldn't find peace in the familiar walls. Her mind refused to settle. She was angry at Ethan for hiding the truth, angry at herself for letting her guard down, for letting him matter, for letting herself imagine a life beyond survival. The rain intensified, loud against the tin roof, the power flickering once, twice, before going dark completely. Her mother lit candles, placing them carefully around the room. Grace lit one near the window and watched as its tiny flame danced wildly with every gust of wind. It felt fitting, inside her chest. Something stormed just as fiercely. By late afternoon, the roads were flooding. Phone service had dropped to 1 bar, and the farmhouse had grown colder. Grace wrapped a quilt around Lucas, humming softly to calm both him and herself. Her mother stirred a pot of soup over the gas stove, the warmth doing little to cut the chill in the air. Then, just after dusk, there was a knock at the door, not loud, but steady, like someone braving the rain just long enough to deliver a message. Grace's heart caught. She rose slowly, crossing the creaking floor. When she opened the door, a gust of wind blew in with the scent of salt and pine. Ethan stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe. His coat clung to his frame, soaked through, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. But his eyes, those same quiet, unreadable eyes, met hers without wavering. He didn't step inside, didn't ask to talk. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was already damp at the edges. "For Lucas," he said softly. He didn't wait for a reply, just nodded once, turned, and walked back down the muddy path toward his car. The taillights faded into the misty darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Grace stood frozen for a moment, the envelope trembling in her hand. Her mother came to her side, but said nothing. She closed the door. Later that evening, after dinner eaten in silence and dishes washed by candlelight, Lucas curled up on the couch. He asked to open the letter. Grace sat beside him, heart pounding as he carefully peeled the damp seal away. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Written in Ethan's precise handwriting, the ink had smudged in places, but the words were still legible. "Dear Lucas, thank you for reminding me that real love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, in laughter over hot cocoa, in stories about whales, in the way someone holds your hand when you're afraid. You've taught me more about strength and kindness in a few months than I learned in years of business meetings and boardrooms. Watching you smile, even on your hard days, has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. I don't know if your mom will ever forgive me. But please know this, I never meant to hurt either of you. And if I did, I'm truly sorry. Take care of her. She's braver than she thinks. Warmly, Ethan Calloway." Lucas read it twice, then looked up. "Mom, why does he think you won't forgive him?" Grace didn't answer. She stared into the candlelight, Ethan's words echoing louder than the storm outside. He hadn't come to plead, hadn't asked for anything. He just said, "Thank you," just goodbye, and somehow, that made it hurt more. The wind had calmed slightly by midnight, but Grace remained at the window long after Lucas had fallen asleep. The rain tapped gently against the glass now, a softer rhythm. She held the letter in her lap, tracing the curve of Ethan's signature with her thumb. All this time, she had guarded herself so fiercely. Love had felt like a risk too big to take again. And yet, here she was, aching in the quiet, not because of what Ethan had done, but because of what she might have lost. What if the story didn't end at betrayal? What if it was just the beginning of something more honest? Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered, more to herself than to the night. What if I was wrong? The farmhouse had quieted, rain had softened to a whisper against the windows, and the candles had burned down to stubs. Grace sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the worn wood, staring into a half-empty cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her mother entered the room, her steps soft but purposeful. The older woman had always moved with a kind of grace that seemed effortless. Even in her 60s, like someone who had weathered enough storms to know when to stand tall and when to sit beside the pain. She pulled out the chair opposite Grace and sat without a word, only reaching out to gently touch her daughter's wrist. The kitchen ticked with silence the clock, the occasional settling creak of the house, the soft breath of the night air pressing through the cracks. "You still love him," her mother finally said, her voice low and even. Grace looked up, startled. "I don't know what I feel." Her mother smiled faintly, as if she'd expected that answer. That's usually how love starts: confused, messy, never clean like in books. Grace shook her head. "He watched me, followed my life, before I ever knew him. He helped your son," her mother replied, calm and steady. "Not for glory, not even for thanks, just to help. That matters." Grace's throat tightened, but he didn't tell me. "He let me believe it was all just business." Her mother leaned back, her gaze distant now, as if traveling back in time. "When you were still a baby, your father nearly lost everything: job, pride, his way, and I had to decide whether to leave or to stay. He wasn't perfect. Gracie? He made mistakes, but he never stopped trying to protect us in the only ways he knew how." Grace listened, her heart thudding slowly. "I learned," her mother continued, "that sometimes love shows up clumsily. Sometimes it doesn't speak when it should. But you can't measure someone only by what they hide. You have to ask why they hid it, even if it hurts." Grace whispered, "Especially then." The room was still for a long time. Then her mother stood, kissed Grace's forehead, and whispered, "Don't be so afraid of being wrong that you miss what might be right." After her mother went to bed, Grace remained in the kitchen, unmoving. Her eyes lingered on the letter from Ethan still lying beside the candle. She rose, almost in a daze, and went to her bag. At the very bottom, folded between a sweater and a stack of unpaid bills, was the file, the one she had found in Ethan's office, the one that had broken everything. She placed it on the table, hands trembling slightly as she opened it again. There were photographs, yes, but not the invasive kind. They were taken at public events, a charity walk, a hospital fundraiser, one where she had spoken briefly about Lucas's condition to raise awareness. In the background of one photo, Ethan stood far away, nearly unrecognizable. There were hospital records copies, not stolen, documents that could have only come from someone who had donated, who had asked for access with permission, and notes, not judgments, not surveillance, notes in Ethan's careful hand. Grace Whitman resilient, protective of son, refuses help, fiercely private, contacted doctor. Burn is in Boston confirmed clinical trial may help Lucas. Avoid approaching too directly. She deserves dignity. Grace's breath caught. Another page. If she ever finds out, she'll never forgive me. But I couldn't do nothing. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. He hadn't watched her to control. He had watched because he didn't know how else to help without scaring her away. Because he had seen her in pain and without words or demands tried to give her a way out. The envelope had always been open. She had just never looked deep enough. Outside, the storm had passed. The last of the clouds scattered, revealing stars behind them, quiet and constant. Grace placed the pages back into the folder, folded her hands over it, and closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she no longer felt angry. Only unsure. But unsure was a beginning, a fragile, flickering beginning, and sometimes that's all forgiveness needs. It was almost dusk when Grace arrived at the Calloway estate. The sky above Camden had turned the soft color of old peach jam, streaked with fading gold as the sun slipped toward the sea. A late summer breeze carried the scent of salt and pine, stirring the curtains in the guest bedroom where she had once stared out in silence. The house loomed quiet before her familiar, but not the same. Neither was she. Grace's hand hesitated at the front gate, fingertips grazing the cold metal. Lucas, now full of energy after his last treatment in Boston, tugged gently at her coat. "Are we really going back?" he asked softly. Grace knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair behind his ear. "Only if it feels right," she whispered. "Not because of a contract, not because we owe anyone anything, only if your heart wants it too." Lucas looked up at the house, then back at his mother. He nodded. They stepped through the gate. Inside, the house was still. No staff lingered in the halls. No clinking dishes from the kitchen. Grace walked through the front door. Unannounced, she still remembered the passcode, though she wasn't sure why. In the library, Ethan sat behind his desk, a glass of untouched whiskey at his side, and a stack of neatly clipped documents in front of him. His face was pale, and his eyes tired, the way people look when they've run out of hope but haven't quite surrendered. When he looked up and saw her, his body froze. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. Grace took a breath and walked inside. "I know what today is," she said softly. "I haven't forgotten." He nodded once. "The contract ends at midnight. I'm not here for the papers." He blinked, startled. Grace stepped closer. "I came back because I want to start again. Without papers, without timelines, without pretending." Ethan's voice was rough. "Why?" "Because I've spent the last 9 years fighting for my son, for his life, his future, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I forgot that I have a heart, too, and it started beating again. Here. With you." Ethan rose from his chair slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. He looked at her with disbelief. "I was going to sign these tonight," he said quietly, gesturing to the divorce documents. "Let you go. No questions, then don't." Before he could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Mom." Lucas's voice rang out. He stepped into the room, eyes lighting up when he saw Ethan. "Dad." The word exploded into the air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Lucas ran across the room and wrapped his arms around Ethan's waist without hesitation. Ethan's arms hung in the air for a moment, stunned, then came down gently, holding the boy like he was made of glass and starlight. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Tears brimmed in Ethan's eyes. "You called me Lucas," pulled back and smiled. "That's what you are, right?" In that single sentence, years of grief, hope, and healing threaded together. Ethan turned to Grace, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure?" She nodded. He reached for the divorce contract slowly, looked at it for a moment, then, with quiet determination, tore it in half. The sound echoed in the library, final and freeing. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. Grace met him halfway. Their embrace wasn't grand or cinematic. It was real, made of broken pieces they were finally willing to carry together. No more pretending, no more conditions. Just a woman who had found the courage to love again, and a man who had finally learned how to be loved. That night, they ate dinner by the fire, nothing fancy, grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup. Lucas talked about space and bugs and books, and neither adult said much. They didn't have to. Later, Ethan tucked Lucas into bed and lingered for a moment as the boy drifted off. Grace watched from the doorway, something soft blooming in her chest. They met again in the hallway. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "But it's the first time in years I've felt something worth being afraid of losing." Grace smiled, and in that quiet, candlelit corridor, they shared a kiss, not desperate, not uncertain, just honest. two hearts finding their way back to one another, no longer bound by contracts or fear. Camden's coastline glowed beneath the early autumn sun, the breeze tinged with the scent of salt and wild rosemary. Waves rolled in gentle rhythm, brushing the sand like a blessing. And there, not far from the old lighthouse that had witnessed their first real moment of tenderness, Grace Whitman stood barefoot in a simple white dress. This time, there were no contracts, no deadlines, no paper between hearts. The ceremony was set up in a crescent of driftwood benches, mismatched cushions, and sprigs of dried lavender tied to each corner. Local neighbors from the Camden community arrived with folding chairs, covered dishes, and quiet smiles. It wasn't grand, it wasn't meant to be. It was honest, unpolished, and profoundly real. Ethan stood at the edge of the sand in a gray linen suit, his hair slightly tousled by the breeze. Beside him, Lucas fidgeted with the small velvet pillow that carried the rings. He had taken his job very seriously, even rehearsed walking in a straight line across the sand the night before. Grace's mother, June, carried the cake herself, a two-tiered lemon confection decorated with sugared violets and hand-whipped frosting. Her hands shook as she placed it on the old wooden table, but her eyes shone with a pride no bakery could ever replicate. As the soft strum of a guitar drifted into the air, played by a teenager from town who once took piano lessons from Grace, the guests turned. Grace walked slowly down the sand, not escorted by anyone, just walking forward as a woman choosing her own joy. The hem of her dress swept over seafoam. Her gaze never left Ethan's. When she reached him, there were no dramatic gasps or scripted words, just a gentle smile as he whispered, "You came back to me." The officiant, an old friend of Ethan's late father, spoke with warmth and sincerity, but the vows, those were what people would remember. Ethan spoke first, his voice steady but soft. "You didn't fall in love with a title or a name. You didn't need me to be a rescuer. You just needed someone who saw your strength and stood beside it. Grace, I promise I'll never try to earn your love with anything other than truth. I promise to show up, every day, not just with good intentions, but with open hands and an open heart." Grace's voice trembled, but her words were clear. "You never asked me to become someone else. You let me carry my past, and you made space for my pain. Ethan, I promise to choose you even on the quiet days, to believe in us when life feels heavy, and to let our love be something Lucas never has to question, only feel." Tears glistened on more than a few faces. And then came the moment Lucas had practiced the rings. He stepped forward with a grin, holding out the pillow. But instead of flowers, he had a small bottle of bubbles in his other hand. With perfect timing, he blew a stream into the air just as Ethan placed the ring on Grace's finger. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," the wind seemed to pause. Ethan didn't hesitate. This kiss wasn't polite or reserved. It wasn't a formality. It was filled with gratitude, with grief finally exhaled, with promises silently made beneath skin and bone. He kissed her like it was the last first kiss of his life. As the bubbles floated around them, Lucas clapped. "Mom says bubbles last longer than flowers," he said proudly. Everyone laughed, a soft, joyful sound that mingled with the sea. After the ceremony, there was no rush to leave. People lingered, sharing stories, passing paper plates, taking turns dancing barefoot on the sand. Someone started singing an old folk song. The tide moved closer, but never intruded, as if the ocean itself was giving them space. Grace sat for a moment on a worn wooden bench, her dress slightly damp from the surf. Ethan joined her, Lucas asleep in his lap, his head resting over Ethan's steady heartbeat. They didn't speak much. They just watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the lighthouse in a silhouette of gold. They had all come through a storm, and now they had found a harbor. The roses bloomed early that summer, crawling up the white trellis outside the Calloway estate, delicate and full like never before. And beneath the morning sun filtering through the kitchen windows, the scent of cinnamon and orange zest lingered in the air. Ethan Calloway stood over a mixing bowl, flour on his forearms, and a puzzled look on his face. I think it's supposed to be folded, not stirred, June said with a smirk, watching him wrestle with the batter. Lucas sat at the table, swinging his legs and giggling as he licked a spoon. Grandma's gonna fire you. Ethan, I'm doing my best. Chef Whitman, Ethan replied, bowing dramatically. But this folding technique, it's a mystery. From the nearby hallway, Grace watched them with a smile too wide to hide. Her hands instinctively rested on her rounded belly 6 months along, with twin girls who already liked to kick when their father spoke too loudly, which was often. The house no longer echoed. The walls, once lined with silence and formality, now held the soft hum of life, real life. There were crayons on the hallway console, a pair of muddy boots at the door, and a hummingbird feeder hanging outside the window that Ethan refilled every few days just in case the birds got lonely. Grace often found herself pausing in doorways, holding still, watching this man who once lived behind glass walls now learn how to soften bread dough with the same patience he once reserved for business deals. Every morning, Ethan took Lucas to school in the old blue pickup truck that once belonged to Grace's father. Lucas insisted it was the coolest ride in town, despite the sticky glove box and the missing radio knob. On the ride home, Ethan would stop by the farmer's market and bring Grace fresh peaches or sunflowers, depending on the season. The evenings were slow and golden. Grace would sit on the front porch, a book in one hand, the other resting on her growing belly, as Ethan rubbed her feet and read aloud articles he thought she'd like. Lucas, now confident in his reading, would sometimes take over and dramatically perform scenes from his school library books, always adding his own twist to the endings. The old pomegranate tree in the backyard, which had once stood bare, was now thick with leaves and promising fruit. It became a symbol of sorts of second chances, of time, and the things that bloom only when given room. Sometimes Grace would catch Ethan staring at her when she wasn't looking during breakfast, as she brushed her hair, or when she laughed too hard at a joke Lucas told. There was something quiet in his gaze. Not possession, not admiration even, but something humbler. Awe, perhaps, or gratitude. She still remembered the man who barely spoke, who carried silence like a shield, and now he danced in the kitchen with her mother while pies cooled on the windowsill. There was healing in these small rituals. It didn't erase the pain from their pasts, the grief, the betrayals, the lonely nights, but it softened them, made space for something new. One evening, as the Camden Summer Festival lit up the sky with color, the Calloway family sat on a picnic blanket near the bluff. Lucas was lying between them, arms behind his head, watching the fireworks burst like laughter across the stars. Grace leaned into Ethan's side, his hand resting protectively over hers on her stomach. The girls were kicking again, tiny reminders that life, unexpected, miraculous life, was always unfolding. "Mom?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice soft but curious. "Did we really start with a contract?" Grace turned to him, startled. Ethan looked over too, but said nothing. The boy sat up, brushing crumbs off his shirt. "I heard Grandma telling Mrs. Taylor about it last week, about how you and Ethan got married because of a piece of paper." There was a pause, the kind where breath slows and the moment opens like a question with no clear answer. Grace looked down at Lucas and reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Yes," she said gently. "We did start with a contract, one that was written with pens and lawyers and deadlines." Lucas tilted his head. "But that's not how it feels now." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "No, sweetheart, that's not how it ended." Ethan's voice joined hers, low and warm. "The paper helped us begin, but love is what made us stay." Lucas nodded thoughtfully, as if storing that truth somewhere only children can reach. The fireworks continued, painting the sky in pinks and silvers and deep blues. Around them, families laughed and children danced with sparklers. But in that small circle, mother, father, son, and 2 little lives yet to arrive, the world had gone still. There was no longer a line between pretend and real. No more terms, no hidden documents, just the soft hum of trust rebuilt and the gentle strength of a love that had been chosen again and again. Grace leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder, eyes on the sky. She thought of all the things that had brought them here: heartbreak, desperation, a ridiculous legal condition, and a man's quiet longing to not die alone. But most of all, she thought of what they'd created. Not just a marriage, not just a family. They had built a home out of broken bricks, a garden out of dust, and somehow, impossibly, they had bloomed. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive wrapped in romance. It comes quietly, in the form of second chances we almost turn away from. Ethan and Grace's story reminds us that healing doesn't always look like grand gestures. It often begins in silence, in kindness, and in small acts of trust. We are all carrying stories, some filled with grief, others with guilt, or quiet sacrifices made in the dark. But love, true love, has a way of reaching into those quiet places and offering light, not to erase the past, but to walk beside it with gentleness. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means choosing not to let it keep us from what could still be beautiful. And sometimes, the family we build through faith, courage, and vulnerability is stronger than the one we're born into. So, if you've been holding back, afraid of loving again, or trusting after betrayal, let this story be your reminder. It's never too late to begin again. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Every view, every comment, and every share helps us continue to bring you stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all of what truly matters. We're so grateful to have you here.